All right, so what stands out in the genealogy? Because all 36 is this crazy genealogy. Did you find anything that stuck out? Anything that you thought, oh, that's interesting?
Well, I thought it was interesting that they named the sons of Esau's wife. That was a little different.
Yep. And there's a few things in there, like one of them discovered water. Or a well in the desert, which was an very important thing if you're wandering nomads, to find a really good water source, which is interesting. God renews his covenant with Jacob. He did that in a previous chapter, in chapter 35. And what's the same and what's different? We're going to talk about that this time. We're going to compare those covenants. Now remember when we started this, for those of you who have been here with me for the whole thing, these narratives deal with the crisis, right? Remember, this is people that are sitting there at the foot of their grandfather or whatever, or Moses or the elders, and they're they're giving them this narrative, this story. And all of these stories have in them some kind of crisis moment. And it goes up, the crisis builds and builds and builds. You think it's resolved, and then all of a sudden something else comes up. Okay, so all of these narratives have that. The ancient Near East, that's their style of writing narratives. They build up a crisis, so you as the audience, the hearers, are getting more and more excited, and then you think it's solved, and then they surprise you. Like with the Abraham narrative. The crisis is, or the issue, the problem is a son. Right? That's one of the issues. God promised him to have a son, to build a nation out of him. And so first off, you think it's Lot. Well, it's not Lot. Okay, then you think it's Eliezer, his servant. And then you think it's Ishmael. And then it's finally Isaac. But what's the crisis? All of a sudden, God asked Abraham to sacrifice Isaac. So all of a sudden you go, wait, we thought it was Isaac, and it's not. But then, of course, God stops him, and you get the consummation of the crisis where it is really Isaac. So we have the same thing in the story of Jacob. So if you could picture it, what would you picture? This building of crisis, or this building of drama. You think it's solved, but then it's not. What do you think it is in this narrative? Just kind of looking back on the whole Jacob narrative. Thoughts?
This is probably not what you're looking for, but it reminds me of the separating of Lot and Abraham.
Yes. We're actually going to talk about that. That's one of the literary nuances. He's comparing that between Esau and Jacob. All right.
Well, you would think it would be solved when he gets back.
Back where?
Back to where Esau is.
Which is? Canaan.
Canaan,
The promised land,
promised
right?
land, yeah.
So how could God's promises come true when he's living in Paddan Aram? That's the crisis. That's the narrative of building. You know, first you're doing okay because he's born, even though he's born number 2. Okay, that's a crisis. And then he steals the birthright. He steals the blessing, and he gets kicked out of the land. And you can see the crisis building. And then he has all this going on with Laban and everything. But he's becoming a nation. So you're starting to think, okay, this is becoming resolved. And then God says, go back to the land, right? And so you think, okay, he's got his whole big family, and he's going back to the land. So what's the crisis that happens on his way back to the land?
He meets Esau.
Yeah. Well, first he wrestles with God, and then second he meets Esau. So you're thinking it's solved, and then all of a sudden he wrestles with God. I mean, what is God trying to do when he wrestles with him, right? And then he's meeting Esau. He doesn't think he'll live through that. He's got 400 fighting men. And then, of course, the end of the crisis is he's in the land. He stays in Bethel and that.
Seems to me you guys always use a crisis as a tension, or crisis intervention.
Yeah.
I think it's interesting too that because there are too many, Esau, who was there the whole time, is the one who leaves.
Yeah.
And Jacob's.
Yes.
Jacob's stayed.
Esau left the promised land. We're actually going to talk about that. And Jacob stayed. All right, flip the page from 97, 98 to 98. Actually, if you could look at 98 and 99 at the same time, just kind of open the page together. Because what we have is the line of Jacob, Israel, and the line of Esau. Okay, the line of Jacob is brought out in 35, verses 22 to 26. And the line of Esau is in Genesis 36, where we just read. Okay, Israel, on page 98, settles close to Bethel, in Migdal Eder, watchtower, or Migdal Edar, which should ring some bells with some of you, if you remember Frankie's sermon, and just the whole thing with Bethlehem and the watchtower, and especially this time of year, because I believe, and this is something totally new I got from Frankie's sermon, I believe Jesus was born in a watchtower. He wasn't born in a stable up behind the motel, like we kind of picture him. He was born in the wilderness in a watchtower called the Migdal Eder, or the Mizpah, okay, out in Bethlehem. And that's where the mangers were. That's where the shepherds were, all of that. So, all right. That's a whole nother story. So you got Jacob as the head of the family. He has 4 wives, Leah, Bilhah, Rachel, and Zilpah. Of course, 2 of them are only wives, the others are the servants. And then you see the line of Leah, Reuben, Simeon, Levi, Judah, Issachar, Zebulun, and then the one female we know of is Dinah, which we've talked about. Okay. And then Bilhah, we have Dan and Naphtali, so that's on the Leah side. On the Rachel side, we have Joseph and Benjamin. And then on the Zilpah, who is Rachel's servant, we have Gad and Asher. Now, Joseph and Levi never became tribes of Judah. And the reason, Levi became the priests of Israel in the Mount Sinai golden calf incident. So they were never listed as their own tribe. And then Judah, I put there. Judah is, of course, the line of King David and Jesus. In the split, they become the tribe identified with the southern kingdom. When Israel split after King Solomon, then it was just Judah. Judah, even though it was a few other partial tribes with Judah, it just became known as Judah. And that's where we get the name Jews from. That's where all of that comes from. And then if you look under Joseph, Joseph had 2 sons, Ephraim and Manasseh. And there's another, we're going to talk about that Manasseh is actually the oldest. But he was, again, the second son was raised above the first son. Ephraim is the youngest. Ephraim and Manasseh were the sons of Joseph in Egypt. Ephraim was the youngest, but was the most blessed. In fact, the tribe became so dominant that when the split happened, Israel was often referred to as Ephraim, and the other tribes forgotten. In men's Bible study right now, we're going through the book of Hosea. And you'll notice that Hosea is talking to Israel. He's a prophet to Israel. He keeps referring to them as Ephraim. Ephraim. Well, they became the biggest tribe. So instead of saying Ephraim and all these other tribes that were a part of Israel, they just said Ephraim because he was the biggest tribe. So Judah and Ephraim became the biggest tribes, and that's where the split happened between Judah and Ephraim. Okay, which is interesting because, again, Joseph was the favored son. So that off red means the tribal leaders, right? In that little box, I put tribal leaders of Judah, Jews, and Israel. All right. Now look at the line of Esau. This is a confusing passage. We're gonna pick it out a little bit for you because there's really 6 different cycles that are in this passage. With multiple names for the same person are used, and wives are combined with concubines, where the children of the concubine are counted as the children of the wife. There's a whole lot of confusion in that. Esau settles in Seir, Edom, south and east of Jacob, and what would be outside of the promised land. So Esau, or Edom, also had 4 wives and concubines. Ada, Aholabama, Basemeth, and Timnah. Now for some reason, their one child, Eliphaz, had 4 sons, and they are the ones that became tribal leaders. Whereas Oholibamah had 3 sons, and they were tribal leaders. Reuel wasn't counted as a tribal leader, but he had 4 sons who became tribal leaders, and Timnah had 1, Amalek. Now, a couple of interesting things about these names that we know. Eliphaz was one of Job's friends. If you read the book of Job, in Job 2 verse 11, it introduces him. Job was from Uz, the Edom area. So we don't know for sure if it's the same Eliphaz, but it's a pretty amazing coincidence if it's not. All right, so when you read the book of Job, and one of the friends, quote unquote, that came to talk to Job was called Eliphaz. And most people put them at about the same time period. All right. And then Amalek, you're going to hear a lot about them. The Amalekites have a long and troubled history with Israel. They were the first to attack Israel as they came close to the Promised Land, and were finally exterminated by King David in 1 Samuel 3. So the Amalekites have a long and difficult history with Israel. They fought them all the time. And these were described as the tribal leaders, those ones, again, in the red. And how many of them are there? There are 12. Is that a coincidence, you think? Probably not. And then below you see they became the Hittites. Actually, 2 of the branches became Hittites, the Hivites and the Amalekites. So you run into them a lot. The Hittites were actually a huge tribe. They ended up being the main ones to battle Egypt for dominance during King David's time, or right before King David. Okay, there's a lot about the Hittites written, again, in the Amarna letters that I have. In the Nag Hammadi, you find a lot about the Hittites. So there's a lot of extra biblical sources for the Hittites.
Were they located between Egypt and Israel?
They were actually located north of Israel,
Oh, okay.
so they had to fight through Israel to get to Egypt. And then Egypt fought through Israel to get to the Hittites. So Israel was the battleground during that whole time. In fact, many of their fights were in the valley of Megiddo, which is Armageddon. Ar, meaning valley, of Megiddo, Armageddon. That's where all those battles took place, in that big valley there. So, Ramses II, who's either has had a great publicist, or he was the most arrogant of Egyptian pharaohs you'd ever run into. He's the one that has all the big monuments, I mean the seated ones at Abu Simbel, which I showed you there. They're seated, and they're still taller than the Statue of Liberty. That's how big these seated Ramses statues are. They put them way in the south so that the Nubians, the Africans, could not, when they start coming up the Nile, or down the Nile, they see these huge figures, they're going, yeah, we don't want to mess with these people, let's turn around and go. That's the thought. But he built all of these. And what he would do is he would take things done by his father and his grandfather and scratch out their name and put his. So you see these big columns with the cartouche is where they put their name in that bullet-shaped kind of oval. Should have a cartouche here somewhere. There's a few of them on here, but and you would see that they're recessed further into the monument, either the pillars or the walls, because he scratched out the one and then carved in his own name for all of these places. So, like I said, he had great publicists, or he was really arrogant, and that's why he's called Ramses the Great. He might not have been that great. All right, flip the page, 100 and 101. Again, we're pulling this all together now. We're ending the Jacob cycle. We're pulling it all together. So the purpose of this genealogy, this is the transitional chapter between Jacob's cycle of Genesis and the Joseph cycle. Most of the transitions happen with genealogies. The last was with Ishmael's genealogy as we transitioned into the Jacob cycle in Genesis 25. The purpose of the genealogy, number 1, is a transition between sections or cycles of the narrative. Okay, when the redactor put this together, he said, I'm going to separate all the sections by putting a genealogy. So you can kind of say, okay, this is where these people were, this is the time period for these people, as he put the narrative together. Genesis 36 verse 7 talks about their possessions being so great they could not live close to each other. Echoes of Lot and Abraham. Gail? In Genesis 13, the genealogy then tells us where he moved out of the promised land. Just like Lot chose the wrong place, Esau chose the wrong place. Okay? It shows Esau's move out of the promised land. And there's an ideological part. Okay, they tell ideological narratives or ideological tales are what?
Why things are the way they are.
Why things are the way they are. So why do snakes crawl in their bellies?
Because God cursed them.
Yeah, because God cursed them, and so if you want to know why snakes crawl in their bellies, there's an ideological tale about that in Genesis 3, right? So that's why things are the way they are. This is a story that says why things are the way they are. Okay, so they tell about all the nations and people that the Hebrews are coming out of Egypt would know that they're going to run into, and so that they understand them. They're going to run into the Amalekites, and they might have actually run into them already. So they should know they come from Esau. And they're actually brothers and sisters. Okay? And the whole story of Balaam and Balak is interesting that way, if we ever get to that in Samuel. No, it's in Numbers. And that whole story, because Balaam considers the Israelites family, because he comes from the Hivites. Shores up the narrative geographically in the east. After this, the rest of Genesis is in the south, in Egypt. Okay, so they're setting us up, saying, okay, all this is happening around Migdal Eder, around Bethel, around Paddan Aram, around this. Now we're going south. The Joseph narrative takes us to Egypt. The rest of Genesis is in Egypt, right? It shows how the blessing even extends to the older brother, like Ishmael and Esau. Because Esau became a great nation. So did Ishmael. They both became great nations through the blessing of the younger son. There are 6 lists in this genealogy, in chapter 36. 6 cycles. The first one, in verses 1 through 8, lists the sons, but the stress is on the wives. Non-Paddan Aram wives. Okay, because remember, Isaac went out of the country, went to Paddan Aram to get Rebekah. Jacob went out of the country to get Leah and Esau. They were from Paddan Aram. Okay, where these wives are the Canaanites. So Esau and Ishmael mixed in the wives of the local, and God said you needed to separate that. So here we see again, the list is on these non-kosher wives that they took. Verses 9 through 14 this is a list that focuses on the sons now, and not on the wives. Okay, so this second list just spends time on those tribal leaders. Verses 15 and 19, this list focuses on the chieftains, or the family heads of these new tribes, or new nations. Verses 20 to 30 is a list of the Horite inhabitants. They seem to have been defeated and assimilated by the descendants of Esau, the Edomites. The Horites were no longer after this. In fact, they can't find hardly any archaeological evidence for Horites outside of the Bible, because they were just wiped out by the Edomites. Verses 31 to 39 is a list of the kings of Edom, interesting in that they do not constitute a dynasty because none of the successors to the thrones are sons of the predecessor. Also interesting is to note that they were kings before Israel had any kings. This could have been the king that Israel wanted to be like when they asked Samuel for a king in 1 Samuel 8. Remember that story? Israel is tired of being run by judges. They want to be like the other nations. So this may be the implication here that, well, you know, Edom, our brothers, have kings. Why don't we have kings? Okay. Or they could be similar to the judges. Maybe they're not really kings. They're more like the judges in Israel. Since they also never had one capital city. They moved around. Once we had King David, we had a capital city, right? In Jerusalem. And that's where the kings stayed as long as they could until they were defeated by Babylon. Right? So whereas the Edom kings never had a dynasty because it was a new king every time, so it could have been more like a judge, like the judges instead of kings, or they were kings, but they never lasted past the life of that one. They were warrior kings. Now I read also that there's a lot of writing in the Amarna letters about Let me put it down again. There's a lot of writing in the Amarna letters about the local nomads. And some people believe that's Esau's descendants from Edom that are keep pestering the Egyptians in Canaan. Because Amarna is an 18th dynasty. Most people believe 19th dynasty, Ramses, is where the Exodus happened. So the people that were doing the pestering then had to be the Edomites that were pestering these Egyptians. And it talks about them stealing from their storehouses, talks about these wandering nomads were raiding they would ambush their trading people that were trading back and forth, and so it's just interesting, whichever one they were. All right, remember the chiasm, 101. The book of Genesis is divided into 3 chiasms and 1 reverse chiasm. Okay, but the 3 cycles, the Abraham, the Jacob, and the Joseph, are designed in chiasms, and again, you only get that through the language. You don't really get that. You know, you can see it once I lay it out like I've laid it out here, but again, you have to kind of manipulate the English to get it to say the same thing that the Hebrew is saying. So remember a chiasm, it's in the shape of an X, and I kind of did the side of an X where it goes down and then comes over. All right, and the focus of the narrative is at the center point of the X, so the chi. The letter chi is X in Greek, chiasm. So if you look at the Abraham cycle, the focus of the Abraham narrative was his name, Abram, changed to Abraham, and Elohim appears to him for the first time. Okay, that was the focus of that narrative. Okay, that's what you should remember from that narrative. He becomes father, Abram, to father of many nations, or father of many nations, Abraham, Abba. So the Jacob cycle, let's just look at the, I'm just going to do the A1 and then the A2, the B1, B2, C1, C2. A1, oracle sought in the struggle with childbirth, and Jacob was born. Remember when Rebecca was going, why is this battling happening here? And she talks to, and God sends her, it's called an oracle, but it's like poetry we read in Scripture, of these 2 nations that are coming from her. Remember that? And then the same thing, A2, oracle is fulfilled. The struggle in childbirth, Jacob becomes Israel. Okay, those 2 nations are finally there that they were talking about, and they end up having to separate because of that struggle. B1, an interlude, Rebecca in a foreign palace, pact with foreigners. B2, an interlude with Dinah in a foreign palace, a pact with foreigners. We talked with Dinah a couple of weeks ago. C1, Jacob fears Esau and flees. C2, Jacob returns and still fears Esau. D1, messengers or angels. D2, messengers or angels. When he leaves the promised land and when he comes back to the promised land, those angels appear. E1, he arrives in Haran. E2, his flight from Haran, away from Laban. F1, Jacob's wives are fertile. F2, Jacob's flocks are fertile. That word fertile is repeated over and over, referring to his wives and referring to his sheep, those black spotted and striped sheep. Which brings us to the focus of Rachel giving birth to Joseph and Jacob's call or deciding to go back to Canaan in 30 verse 25 and 26. Those 2 things happen simultaneously. Joseph is born and it's time to go back to Canaan. God tells him to go back to Canaan, back to the promised land, which also is, if you follow the narrative, remember the crisis of the narrative, and that's going to be actually on the next page. That's where that happens. That crisis happens. Right? So flip the page then, and you'll see, well, I'm not quite up to the crisis. You actually see it on 103. So I might want to just kind of put those again, 102 and 103 open together. And you can see that chart where it talks about the crisis, because I'm going to talk about it here. Conflict and resolution in the historical narrative. Any kind of literature that is conflict that pushes along the narrative. In any kind of literature, it is the conflict that pushes along the narrative. The ending or the climax of the story is the resolution of that conflict. The collective sigh of the audience. Oh, he made it, right? Remember, there is no reading in the mind in biblical writing. 98% of the reading you do is in your mind, isn't it? not 100%. Right? You know what I'm talking about. You sit down with a book in front of the fire and you read. It all goes out in your mind. It's not done out loud. That's exactly the opposite here. So remember, you're always hearing. You're always hearing the words of God. So that narrative that you're hearing, you're building up that drama that you get in books, you know, the climax of a book, right? You just think it's resolved and then there's a surprise ending. I will never forget the ending to the Foundation trilogy. Anybody science fiction fans here? Isaac Asimov's most famous work that made him famous is called the Foundation trilogy. After that he did I, Robot and a few other ones. But the Foundation trilogy, the last 3 chapters of the 3rd book is the answer. The second to the last chapter is the answer that satisfied. And then the last chapter of the book is the answer that was true. And so you're thinking at the 3rd to last chapter, oh, that's the answer to this crisis, to this climax. And then you read the next chapter and you go, oh, that makes sense. Now I get it. That's what it should be. That's the one that satisfies, that makes you happy. And then you write the last chapter, the answer that was true. And you're going, I can't believe it at the end. And that's a good writer does that, right? That's what you're looking for at the end of the book, is that kind of climax where you get the resolution finally, and it may be a surprise ending or something that you love might happen. Finally, the two get together or whatever, right? That's what it did. Now remember, you're hearing that as good little Hebrew boys and girls. As your grandfather is telling you these stories, you're hearing this. All right? Alliteration. You get a lot of alliteration. You get a lot of wordplay or sounds like. You get a lot of perspective of the narrator or reader. You get surprise information in the characters that is known to the listeners, like the testing of Abraham. You knew it was a test, but Abraham didn't. So you as the listener knows that it's a test, but Abraham doesn't. So that gives you a different perspective. And in fact, you don't get as angry with God, right? If you knew, or if you didn't know it was a test, and God said to Abraham, just picture this. Okay, you're good Hebrew boys and girls sitting around the fire, and I tell you, God told Abraham to sacrifice Isaac. You're going, what? But if I said, God decided to test Abraham and asked him to sacrifice his son, suddenly God's off the hook, right? It's a test. You know it's a test. Okay? And then there's surprise information to the listeners that is known only to the characters. For instance, Abraham and Sarah are brother and sister. He didn't lie about that, like we all thought he did in Egypt. Oh, this is my sister. All right, we find out later they really were brother and sister, half brother and sister. Remember, this is still ancient Near East historical narrative, so rule number 5 on narrative logic still applies. Okay, details don't matter except when they advance the narrative. Okay, so I'm going to read you, it's the very first one I gave you. Rule number 5, we must understand that the Old Testament was written from an Eastern mindset with narrative logic as opposed to Western mindset with Aristotelian logic. In narrative logic, contradictions not only are possible, they aren't even noticed because the details aren't important. Of course, in Aristotelian logic, contradictions are impossible. And details are critical and must be logical and in time. So remember, we're coming from a Near Eastern mindset here, which is totally different than our logic, Western, Aristotelian mindset. Everything you were taught in school was Western logical mindset. 2 + 2 = 4. That's not necessarily true in the Far East, in the ancient Near East. In fact, if it pushed your narrative that 2 + 2 = 5, you'd write that. The details aren't important. What's important is the story, the narrative, the point of the story. So you get a lot of that in this narrative. All right, so look on page 103. You see the conflict and resolution. He's born the second son. You're going, oh man, how's he going to be the father of nations? He's born the second son. He gets, I put, and maybe I should have put that in quote, he gets the birthright. He gets the blessing. He sees Bethel. Bethel means what?
God's house.
Yeah, God's house, house of God. right? El, meaning God, and Beth, meaning house. He's forced out of the promised land. And all of a sudden, the crisis is at its peak when he's forced out. How can he be our, good Hebrew boys and girls, how can he be our father? If he leaves the promised land, the crisis is there. Okay? And then the crisis is resolved in Joseph, and when he starts heading back, you're going, okay, here's the end. We got it now. Okay, he's on his way back to the promised land. He's got his whole family. Joseph is born from his favorite wife. Whew, we're relaxing. But then all of a sudden, what happens at the border? He wrestles with God. And then he understands that Esau is coming after him with 400 warriors, and suddenly the crisis is back on, and you good Hebrew children listening to this are going, oh no, what's going to happen to our father? So the crisis is back on again. Jacob wrestles with the angel, prepares for Esau, and then he's back in Bethel. And Esau leaves. And that's the end of the crisis. That's the end of the Jacob narrative. Jacob, is now Israel in the promised land. All right, let's take a look at the blessings while we still have a little bit of time here yet. Again, it'd be good to open the two pages together, 104 and 105, just kind of open them together. And look at all the blessings. So I have there for you Abraham, God blessing Abraham, God blessing Isaac, and then the 2 times God blessed Jacob in that covenant. And then the 2 shaded below is Isaac blessing Jacob, and Isaac blessing Jacob a second time. If you remember the narrative, he blessed him kind of as Isaac deceived him, gave him the blessing. But then as he was leaving, he blesses him again. All right? So let's just read Jacob's blessing number 2, which is on page 105. This is the one we're talking about. This is one just last week, in last chapter. Jacob is your name, Jacob shall be your name no more, for your name shall be Israel. And he called his name Israel. Now remember, I'm taking these out of the Fox translation, so it might be a little different than yours. I am El Shaddai. Interesting. Look at the other ones, what he calls. I am Yahweh, or I am the God of Abraham your father. I am El of Abraham your father. Do not be afraid. The first Isaac blessing calls him Yahweh, but the second Isaac blessing calls him El Shaddai. Interesting. Bear fruit and be many. Nation, yes, a host of nations shall come from you. Kings from your loins. Again, that parallels all the other green you see there. Your seed will be like the dust of the earth. I'll make your seed many for the sake of Abraham. I'll make your seed many. Yes, many. May you bear fruit and make you many, so that you become a host of peoples. So, and then the blue. The land I gave to Abraham and Isaac, to you I give it, and to your seed after you I give the land. Okay, the first Jacob blessing said the same thing. The land on which you lie I give to you and your seed. The Isaac's blessing, for you inherit the land of your sojournings. Isaac's first blessing, may the people serve you, be master of your brothers, may your mother's seed bow down to you. Okay, and you shall inherit the gate of your enemies. So notice the similarities, notice the differences. I think the biggest one is the name of God. Why do you think the name of God is different than these? El Shaddai, or Yahweh?
I thought it was sort of like a progression, but here it's sort of coming back.
It's back and
I was
forth.
wrong.
Now we have El Shaddai. What does El Shaddai mean again? There are 2 interpretations for it. One is God of the mountains, okay, which came out of Seir, which Moses' father-in-law, Jethro, was a priest of El Shaddai, God of the mountains. Or Melchizedek was also talks about El Shaddai with Melchizedek. That was the God he served. The other word, or the other El Shaddai, is literally God of the breasts, which is the fruitfulness of. So that's why he says right after that, bear fruit and be many. Okay, nations, just a host of nations will come from you, kings from your loins. So it's the fruitfulness of it. Sorry to be a little crude, but you can see why mountains and breasts, the same kind of thing in the ancient Near East, right? So you can interpret it both ways. Okay, the fruitfulness of it or the God of power in the mountains. Right? Abraham got a double blessing and Jacob got a double blessing. Introduction, I am the God of, but Isaac is told not to be afraid. Number one, I'm just going through the differences here. Notice that Jacob's father is Abraham, but not Isaac's. And a couple of interesting differences in the blessings there. So, good Hebrew boys and girls, what do you hear? And after a couple of nights, you got through the whole narrative that your grandparents are telling you around the fire. What do you think about yourself? Again, these stories, these narratives were told in Scripture for them to establish an identity, who they are, who they were. That's the purpose of these historical narratives, to establish who they were, because they didn't know. After probably minimum 200 years, maximum 400 years in Egypt, they lost their identity, who they were. Okay, so now Moses is trying to build that up for them again, or God through Moses. So who are you, Israel, based on the Jacob cycle? Who do you think you are? Who do you think you are? Promised people. Yeah, you see a lot with the blessing. And how do you feel about the land you're now heading to? Right? Why would I want to leave Egypt? I mean, I had all the food I wanted in Egypt. Just think of the Nile River and all the beautiful, they even talk about missing cucumbers, right? In the Scripture it talks about that. They missed the leeks and the cucumbers that they had in Egypt. So why would I want to leave all this abundance of Egypt? Okay, all the grain you can eat and all the... So we were slaves. But we had 3 squares a day, right? So yeah, it gives them a picture of this promised land that they were heading to, and that it was their birthright. But it's kind of justified, and I understand that people have problems with this nowadays, but it justifies the wiping out of all those other nations. The death and destruction we're going to talk about, all these other nations. And the battle's still going on today between the descendants of Esau and Ishmael and the descendants of Jacob and Israel and Isaac. Right? Well, those battles still go on today. What else would you hear?
God is in control.
God is in control. We have heroes, the patriarchs, the heroes of our... And they were flawed, just like us. They weren't perfect people. For sure Jacob was not a perfect person. Right? Even Abraham, that's the father of our faith, wasn't the perfect person we thought he was. And this epic, this underlying epic, you can see the transition here from the epic tale to the more historical tale. Whereas we get with Joseph now, I'm going to have a lot of Egyptian archaeological evidence for Joseph, because just the fact that he dreams. And what does he dream of? You remember the dreams? What bows down to him?
Sheep.
Sheaves of wheat. What's Egypt full of? Sheaves of wheat. This is when he's not in Egypt yet. What else bows down to him? The sun, sun, moon, and stars. Which, if you walk in any temple, the ceiling is just the blue and black. That's the stars all through that. Those are very clear Egyptian signs, just as his dreams. And then, of course, with the famine for Pharaoh, the lean years and the fat years, I will show you granaries that were built by, some say even by Joseph. Okay, depending on, again, when you want to date it. Same lessons we can draw. We have a God in control, don't we? And Paul says that the ancestry of the Jews are our ancestry as well. And God is in control, and we are his people, his chosen people. and it's not, but then of course God stops him, and you get the consummation of the crisis where it is really Isaac. So we have the same thing in the story of Jacob. So if you could picture it, what would you picture? This building of crisis, or this building of drama. You think it's solved, but then it's not. What do you think it is in this narrative? Just kind of looking back on the whole Jacob narrative. Thoughts?
This is probably not what you're looking for, but it reminds me of the separating of Lot and Abraham.
Yes. We're actually going to talk about that. That's one of the literary nuances. He's comparing that between Esau and Jacob. All right.
Well, you would think it would be solved when he gets back.
Back where?
Back to where Esau is.
Which is Canaan,
Canaan,
the
yeah.
promised land,
The promised
right?
land, yeah.
So how could God's promises come through when he's living in Paddan Aram? That's the crisis. That's the narrative of building. Esau left the promised land. We're actually going to talk about that in Jacob stayed. All right, flip the page from 97, 98 to 98. Actually, if you could look at 98 and 99 at the same time, just kind of open the page together. Because what we have is the line of Jacob, Israel, and the line of Esau. Okay, the line of Jacob is brought out in 35, verses 22 to 26. And the line of Esau is in Genesis 36, where we just read. Okay, Israel, on page 98, settles close to Bethel, in Migdal Eder, watchtower, or Migdal Edar, which should ring some bells with some of you, if you remember Frankie's sermon, and just the whole thing with Bethlehem and the watchtower, and especially this time of year, because I believe, and this was something totally new I got from Frankie's sermon, I believe Jesus was born in a watchtower. He wasn't born in a stable up behind the motel, like we kind of picture him. He was born in the wilderness in a watchtower called the Migdal Eder, or the Mizpah, okay, out in Bethlehem. And that's where the manger's. You know, first you're doing okay because he's born, even though he's born number 2. Okay, that's a crisis. And then he steals the birthright, he steals the blessing, and he gets kicked out of the land. And you can see the crisis building. And then he has all this going on with Laban and everything, but he's becoming a nation. So you're starting to think, okay, this is becoming resolved. And then God says, go back to the land, right? And so you think, okay, he's got his whole big family and he's going back to the land. So what's the crisis that happens on his way back to the land?
He meets Esau.
Yeah. Well, first he wrestles with God, and then second he meets Esau. So you're thinking it's solved, and then all of a sudden he wrestles with God. I mean, what is God trying to do when he wrestles with him, right? And then he's meeting Esau. He doesn't think he'll live through that. He's got 400 fighting men. And then, of course, the end of the crisis is he's in the land. He stays in Bethel and all that.
Seems to me guys always use a crisis as attention. We're a crisis intervention.
Yeah.
I think it's interesting too that because there are too many, Esau, who was there the whole time, is the one who leaves,
Yeah.
and Jacob's
Yes.
are, yeah.
All right, so what stands out in the genealogy? Because all 36 is this crazy genealogy. Did you find anything that stuck out? Anything that you thought, oh, that's interesting?
Well, I thought it was interesting that they named the sons of Esau's wife. That was a little different.
Yeah. And there's a few things in there, like one of them discovered water. Or a well in the desert, which was an very important thing if you're wandering nomads, to find a really good water source, which is interesting. God renews his covenant with Jacob. He did that in a previous chapter, in chapter 35. And what's the same and what's different? We're going to talk about that this time. We're going to compare those covenants. Now remember when we started this, for those of you who have been here with me for the whole thing, these narratives deal with a crisis, right? Remember, this is people that are sitting there at the foot of their grandfather or whatever, or Moses or the elders, and they're they're giving them this narrative, this story. And all of these stories have in them what's some kind of crisis moment. And it goes up, the crisis builds and builds and builds. You think it's resolved, and then all of a sudden something else comes up. Okay, so all of these narratives have that. The ancient Near East, that's their style of writing narratives. They build up a crisis, so you as the audience, the hearers, are getting more and more excited, and then you think it's solved, and then they surprise you. Like with the Abraham narrative, the crisis is, or the issue, the problem is a son, right? That's one of the issues. God promised him to have a son, to build a nation out of him. And so first off, you think it's Lot. Well, it's not Lot. Okay, then you think it's Eliezer, his servant. And then you think it's Ishmael. And then it's finally Isaac. But what's the crisis? All of a sudden, God asked Abraham to sacrifice Isaac. So all of a sudden you go, wait, we thought it was Isaac.